Thanks you guys for coming in this morning to hear our presentation. So what I'm going to be covering today is really the State of the Union for our PED research, as well as go over a couple of the different informational sites that I use when we assess what's going on in the U.S. as far as PED and status. So where are we at today? A lot of people say, is it just in the U.S.? Is it in Canada? Where else is the virus? Well, we had a meeting back in September that USDA ran, and they invited a whole bunch of different people from all over the world. And so the nice thing is we're not in this alone anymore. The virus originated in a lot of the Asian countries, so China, Japan, South Korea, Thailand, and it's still active there and endemic. So it's essentially an ongoing disease. However, we do know Canada went positive back in January of 2014, and then we had discussions with other countries looking in Europe, where is it at there, and we identified that it is not in UK, at least the current Chinese strain. There was a different strain of PED that was identified back in the 1970s, but it's different. That strain was different from what we're seeing in other parts of the world. But the virus has been identified in Germany, Spain, France, a lot of South American countries, Mexico, Colombia, Ecuador, also recently in the Ukraine, and that's drawn some concern and interest from other neighboring countries around there. So it is a worldwide disease. As we assess it, it is still considered a production disease because it is swine only, and it has an impact obviously on swine production. Back when we first identified this, we had our hands tied in 2013 because the only thing we knew about it to deal with the virus was through feedback and biosecurity. Since that time, obviously, we've had a couple of vaccines that have been licensed or conditionally licensed within the U.S., so our tools to deal with the disease have been expanded since that time. So the next few slides are going to show some of the different reports that we utilize. This one is from the American Association of Swine Veterinarians. And what it does, it gives you an idea of the case reports. And what the case reports are is just how many cases are positive for PED that have been submitted to a diagnostic lab. So for example, at Minnesota, if they had 20 cases submitted for PED and 10 were positive, that would show up as 10 positive case reports. And so what this graph is trying to do, is really to look at what is the curve of the disease over time as we get all these cases coming in. So obviously this is 2013. When it first started, had a slow ramp up. We got to winter, really got into play, top of the year in January, February, March. It spiked up, I think it was mid-March, and then since that time has come down. And you can see we have had a few increased cases, which is not completely unexpected because the virus is more active in winter. But here in January now it's dropped back again. And so what this is telling us is that obviously our caseloads are not as aggressive as what we have seen in the past. And so this is ongoing. It's available even if you're not a veterinarian. You can still go to that AASV website and see this information. This report is from USDA. Since June 5th, USDA has made PED a reportable disease, and so this is a big, long website. But you can go to this website. They have a pretty lengthy report. I pulled this graph out because it shows some of the states. Obviously, since this is a bit old of a report, but since that time we do have cases in Nevada as well as Hawaii. And so there's approximately 33 different states that have had known positive cases identified. And so really that encompasses all of our major swine production areas in the U.S. as well as Hawaii, which you wouldn't think is a huge production state, but they do have a fair amount of pig production. This next report I use is actually from researchers here in Minnesota, Dr. Bob Morrison, and it's a unique project that we funded several years ago really to look at PRRS. When PED came online, we wanted to use that as well to track what's the status of PED, what's it doing on the farms, how is it moving through a system. And so Bob applied this project. There's about 20 different systems that have agreed to share information about their herds, and it encompasses about 2.1 million sows. And so we use this report. Again, it shows very similar information to what AASV has, but this is actual cases of herds that have gone through PED or not. And so it follows a very similar trend. It started out in 2013, ramped up, and then come back down, and you can see there's very minimal activity at the tail end of last year into this year. So that's good news. Can I answer why? No. But there's a lot of things in play that's helping us out. Our increased biosecurity, our increased herd immunity, our increased vaccine usage. All of those things can contribute to why we're seeing the reduction of disease. So that's kind of the status of where we're at. The next section is really covering what have we done, or what's our research knowledge that's been going on since 2013. So here's a very brief summary, and I'll get into some more detail, but the activities that we had. Obviously in 2013, we did not have any information on this virus other than what was developed and could be gotten from overseas research. So we really needed to fill the gap in 2013 to get the basics of the disease down. And so we funded at Pork Board about 14 different projects for about $1 million. And so that covered, again, basics of disease. 2014, obviously it was still a problem, so we ramped up even more, funded around 35 different projects to the tune of about $2 million, and again, really honing in on some very specific and tangible goals and questions. And so, for example, in 2013, we really needed to know the basics of PED, the who's, the what's, the where's, the why, how does it infect, how long does it last, how do we kill it? So we really focused on learning the basic understandings of the virus. Diagnostic tests was another huge deal because obviously with a new disease we had a few tests, but they only covered certain things. They didn't really cover the breadth of all we needed to know about the virus. So we put a lot of money into diagnostic tests. And then the last one is looking at basics of how does it transmit from farm to farm, how long does it survive in various conditions, and so that's also a big focus. Towards the tail end of the year in 2013, we started to have questions. How do we gain immunity in sows? If the sow gets sick, how long does her protection last, and how well does she pass that on to the babies? And so we started to fund some studies. Those were longer term, 12-month studies to better understand how PED acts in the sows. When we looked at these basic questions, essentially all of those projects were done on a 6-month basis. And so from a research side, that's extremely quick. But a lot of our universities and other groups really stepped up to get the job done. So coming around to 2014, obviously after Canada had their break in January and had really kind of honed in on the feed side and feed transmission, that brought up a lot of questions again in the United States. As far as what is the risk that feed and feed ingredients and feed systems bring to modern production, and how do we address that? Are there interventions like time, temperature, chemicals? We just didn't know that. And so what happened is we had a feed consortium in late March that led to development of research priorities for feed that got implemented, and we funded a lot of studies. Other questions focused on biosecurity validation, and really that was focused on looking at disinfectants. What disinfectants work, what don't? Are they effective against PED? What parameters? How long do you have to have contact time? We started looking at those type things, as well as looking at transportation again. And then lastly, we had animal focus. Again, really immunity. What is immunity? How is it developed? How do we test for it? And then looking at porcine delta corona. Those are some really highlights for 14. Here now in 2015, we have had a call that we did in the fall of last year. We will be selecting proposals in February, but we asked more specifics on building on information that was done for sow immunity. And so we've got several proposals that are looking at sow immunity. They're looking at some unique and novel feed interventions, in addition to working off of some data and research that was learned from this past year. And then the last one is looking at novel vaccines. While we have 2 vaccines out there, we're still learning about the immunology of how they work and how long they work. And so we wanted to make sure that there's still continued focus and development on getting us the best vaccine available, or at least looking at the technologies. So that's why we funded those. So those research projects will be selected this February. Everything else has been funded and it should be out there. So what do we learn? It's too short to tell you everything, so I will say up front, this is going to be a pretty 30,000-foot broad view. If you want to know more, go to pork.org/PED, and all of the research projects that we have funded to date are out there online. And there's also, they're online. So we know PED can survive in a variety of different conditions. The colder the weather, the longer the virus can survive. But it does like water and other organic material to survive. So if you have a dirty trailer, if you have lagoon water, the virus can withstand time and stay viable. So we know it can survive in pits, in feed slurries, manure, fresh and recycled water, and even feed ingredients for different lengths of time. Cold conditions, we recently did a study on pit survival because that was a question this fall as we start to put manure out on the ground. How long can it survive? Well, we found positive samples at 4 and 6 months post-infection of a farm, but when we actually put that virus back into naive baby pigs, the only positives we found were at the 4-month time frame. We did not find anything at 6 months post-infection. And so what that told the researchers is that there's that span between 4 and 6 months where the virus at some point in time becomes inactive. However, there is always caveats with these studies. You know, there's a certain number of studies and farms that are utilized. It is a relative guideline. It's not something that's going to be absolute because there's just a lot of things involved. But we wanted to know, is there a time where that virus may or may not start to die out? So what do we do with this information? Well, we try to use a lot of the data to help give guidelines for you all to be able to work on the farms, work in manure, and yet still do your day-to-day operations, but also have some disease control. And so we know the virus can survive for extended amounts of time. That's why it's so critical for cleaning and disinfection with the right products, because that will help reduce the viral load. When you're dealing not just with pit and manure issues, but any kind of servicing issues, it's best to go to farms that have had the longest time from when they were first infected to when you have to go work to them, and then always work the most recently infected farms last. Again, it's that viral load. Virus seems to go down over time, so the more time you can put in there, the better. But I also write communication, because a lot of times, you know, you may know your neighbors, you may not, but even if you're working across counties, across state lines even, it's really important to communicate status and what things are happening, just so everybody knows and can manage their own systems and farms for the best disease control and prevention. We've got guidelines here that have been developed to try to help people in different aspects of manure handling, but in a lot of other things too. Same thing applies to transportation. The good thing is we can kill the virus through heat. If you hold a trailer after it's cleaned at 160 degrees for 10 minutes, that in this trial killed the virus. It did not survive. The flip side, they wanted to see if you just left it at room temperature at a certain length of time, this time was for a week, will it kill the virus? And it did. Again, over time the virus did degrade. However, the best combination, if you can, is clean, disinfect, get rid of the organic material, and then apply heat if at all possible, or at least let the machinery and equipment dry overnight. And so, again, we do know other disinfectants, such things as quaternary ammoniums, glutaraldehydes, to synergize. There's some work being done on Excel. It's an accelerated hydrogen peroxide. There's also been work on other products such as bleach and phenolics that we know can kill coronaviruses. So there is information out there on the disinfectants that we commonly use in industry are effective against PED. So other key messages with transportation, really to look at a line of separation. And again, this is stuff that we've done in industry for a long time, but it's really important that whatever is outside stays outside, whatever's inside, if it's clean, stays clean. And so to make sure that you draw a line and say, if I'm working inside of the barn, I want to keep it as clean as possible. If I have to go outside of that clean area, then you should have some intervention steps in between of coming back in, so you're not bringing something back into the farm. But that can also go as not carrying anything out as well, if you are fighting the disease. So keep things clean and dry, avoid contamination at high risk. Again, organic material, it's kind of a common theme. Clean and dry will go long ways for not just PED, but for things like PRRS, for influenza, for TGE. And the same message about working at the most recently infected farms last, just to reduce the viral load. So here's just some pictures. Again, this one is just showing at the red line that interface between the farm chute and the trailer, not crossing that line, especially if it's somebody that the trailer is not owned by you or not controlled by you. Again, you're not dragging anything from the trailer back into your farm. Other things, this is just a feed truck driver getting out of his cab, putting booties on. So that way, whatever he had in the cab is not coming onto your farm, and likewise, whatever is on your farm, he's not going to carry back into his cab. And same thing, there's just a bench before going into the main office or going into a farm, taking your shoes off or your outer clothing and outer footwear before you go over the bench and go into the farm. Just having that break of disease control. So again, we also have guidelines for different types of transportation for feed systems, for just general transportation, and even for truck wash, because there's certain sequencing of cleaning, disinfection that you can do that will help, again, reduce viral load and give you a better shot at managing this disease. Feed systems is a big one. I know Dr. D presented some information yesterday about some of the different interventions that they have been trialing. We've got a lot of similar information and things that we've learned. It really takes a very small amount in feed to be able to infect a pig. And okay, you might say, well, that's nice. What do we do with that? Well, it gives us an idea of, if you're looking at an intervention, how much do you have to reduce that amount of virus to be effective? If it takes a lot of virus to infect a pig, things that reduce it by a log, 2 logs, or really that make an impact on disease help. But for PED, it's very unique because it only takes a small amount. So we really have to watch some of those things that could end up as contaminating feed or feed systems. Just like Dr. D showed, we have another trial that looks at other feed additives you can add to feed can help in reducing the amount of virus. So formaldehyde-based, whether it's Terminate or Salcurb, those products can work to reduce the level of PED in a mixed feed. Other things like medium-chain fatty acids, essential oils. I'm not a nutritionist, and for once, if that's saying that, I don't know anything about that. But there are things that you can utilize to help reduce the amount of virus. And that study was done out of Kansas State by Cassandra Jones. And then other things, we do know some work's being finalized of pelleting and heat treatment. So after you make a feed, or while you're making that pelleted feed, heat can have an impact and reduce the amount of virus to almost 0. And so there's things like that that we know are effective to help try to get some headway against the virus. The next one is immunity. That's always the big one. As we look at that, we know we can get immunity to the virus. There's different tools. We've been working on diagnostics that tell us what level of immunity a sow has. So we can tell if the virus is there by PCR. Well, we can also tell what has the animal had as exposure. So that's the ELISA test in the blood, or the IFA, the immunofluorescent antibody, that can say, has this animal been exposed? If it has, great, we can tell it. But then we're working on these other tests, the FFN and IFA, that says what level of immunity a sow has, because that's something we have not been able to predict. So we're starting to get that ability. So what does that mean? Well, we know basics, gut immunity is definitely needed locally. So that means you actually have to get the virus to the gut to create either a simulated infection or a natural infection, and that is an absolute need for that sow to be able to build protection for her baby pigs. The sows do respond, but it can vary. So not all sows react the same way to the virus. It's very similar like humans. Even if you get vaccinated for a disease, you may or may not respond. Not everybody is the same. And then same thing with the sows. But we do know piglets need to consume the milk to be protected against PED, and so that's another absolute. Sows do respond to feedback and develop antibodies, and so that's really important. So when we look at exposure's got to be oral through her mouth, and that can either be through feedback or through just natural exposure. Now, a lot of people ask about vaccines. How do they work? You know, right now the vaccines we have are killed, so you have to give them as an injection. So you're giving a mass of antigen to that sow, and hopefully that sow will develop exposure or immunity to that antigen in the shot. But again, the shots are not at the local gut level. They help boost immunity if she's had it in the gut first, but they can't make up as a primary source. So There's been some work looking at naive gilts and vaccine of how can it protect those naive animals, but we know just physiologically that's just not as good as having the gut infection first and then following up with having the vaccine second. Dr. Murtaugh here at Minnesota has been working on immunity. We know it's around 6 to 7 months. And so again, it does have a finite period and we're still trying to work on that. We do know there's work being done on cross protection, some of these less virulent strains against the heavy virulent strains. And so those are some of the things we're going to be focusing on for 2015 as we move forward to really understand those things. So the good news is immunity can be developed. We are making headway on maintaining that immunity, but we still have some questions left. So very brief review, but we do put out about every other week. We've got updates on different proposals and projects. So if you go to the porc.org site, all of our research, and it's outlined by year 2013, 14, and 15, all of the research projects that we have are listed online with the objectives and any current results. And then there's also, again, the PED research book that puts a lot of these things that we've learned into basic production protocols.